going to get at how race and racial bias just tangle and complicate a lot of what we come to see as our system. And that's been the focus of your writing. A lot of your writing looks at the systemic changes and how race and the system that we have thus far have created the problem. One of the ways you combat systematic change is civil claims that individuals can bring against police officers. Your article there was Death Penalty on the Streets, and a really catchy way to capture what's happening. Can you explain to us why you went with the title Death Penalty on the Streets and how that relates to civil claims that people can bring against the police?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've labeled what's happening with police unjustifiably killing individuals, and specifically Black people, as the death penalty on the streets. And I'll give you a little bit of background on this idea. So the whole idea came about because I was preparing for a lesson basically, to a community group about the death penalty. And at the same time, this was 2014, at the same time, the news broke about Michael Brown being killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And so I'm being killed by a police officer, of course. So at the same time that I'm preparing to explain to people about the protections that the death penalty give before the state can execute someone, I'm being bombarded with these images on TV about somebody who was unarmed, being killed out in broad daylight in the street with really no protections at all. And so I had this just really interesting back and forth in my mind, thinking about all of the protections that we give under the 8th Amendment. So that the Supreme Court has read the 8th Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment to guarantee certain procedural protections before someone is executed. So the death penalty can't be arbitrary. It can't be mandatory. Jurors have to have the choice to choose something else. It, of course, can't be solely based on race. We have to think about proportionality. So we save the death penalty for our most serious offenses. In addition to proportionality, we have to have this overall regard for human dignity. So we can't torture people, right? And so this idea that we have all of these protections to protect human dignity once we go through the entire judicial process, but at the same time on the street, it's like this extrajudicial killing that's happening. And so I saw it as really punishment that's happening on the streets just outside of the justice system with the protections that the court has said are necessary to really protect people from cruel and unusual punishment. And so that's what was going on in my mind. I prepared before this was an article, before Death Penalty on the Streets was an article, it was a TED Talk. So I prepared it for TEDx Toledo, and I think it really resonated with people because it was more of a view of the reality that they were seeing than any other way we've been talking about policing issues.
So as I read the article, it's really subtly radical. And I kind of want to talk about a part of it, and maybe I read it wrong. I hope I didn't. But when I think about the civil claims we bring against police, it's often in the 4th Amendment, or maybe there's some excessive force claims available in certain contexts. And when you bring the 8th Amendment in and you talk about punishment, my head goes to, well, we don't really think about the police as punishers. We think about them as investigators, or sort of the initial step in this long criminal process. And the key to that, to me, has always been the presumption of innocence. Like, that's this legal fiction that we created, and it's the keystone of the American system. But what you're saying in the article, I think, is we as Americans don't give the black people, especially Black men, that protection. We don't presume they're innocent. And why? So then why stick to this legal fiction if it's masking this very scary reality? Is that kind of a fair read here?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you picked up on it that way, because when I think about it, I said it was presented as a TED Talk. And so this concept of the death penalty on the streets was supposed to be provocative and really draw people in. But as I worked it into an academic article, I was really thinking that the reason why this title, the death penalty on the streets, and this concept really resonated with people is because it better reflected reality. So even though in some legal minds, including judges, they would say that police don't punish, right? That punishment comes after somebody is tried or they plead guilty, which is what mostly happens, after they're convicted and they have all of these protections of due process, and all those fair protections, and then we get to the punishment phase. But that's not the reality of what people experience, right? And so when especially the Black experience, so at the hands of police, it's most certainly seen as the force that's imposed on Black individuals by police most certainly feels like punishment, right? And so that's what Black people are experiencing. And so if you think about it that way, then the police right there on the street are imposing penalties just through the use of force on Black bodies for, think about our recent cases. So they're imposing punishment for selling loose cigarettes, for jaywalking, for using a forged $20 bill, right? Things that certainly, have been criminalized. That's another topic on whether many of these things should be criminalized. But they have been, and it's a way of getting around the court process and just exacting punishment right there on the streets. And so, and if we take this even further, if you think about it as being radical, it only feels radical because you use the term radical is meant to say it's against the established norms, right? And that's really the whole point, which is that we've refused to think about what's happening in the streets as punishment because we've set up this fiction of no, punishment only goes through this fair system, right? But for everyday people, this is very much punishment. And if we're going to honor that reality, then we need to deal with it as such and give the protections there as well.
And that's the other piece. So the one part that really kind of jolts you, and you don't get a jolt reading law review articles very often. So thank you. But the one piece of it is this sort of shock to the establishment system. But the other part of it is this plain spoken way of saying police are a hammer in many respects. But the arm that holds the hammer is the society that we live in and the norms that we have. And you talk a lot about how if you want to change where the hammer goes, or even whether we hold a hammer at all, you got to do something about that arm. And I'm losing the metaphor here, but we have to make some real changes to the way we view Black bodies in our country. And can you talk a little bit about the way that comes into your work, like how it is that we've come to view Black people as criminal, such that punishment on the streets is okay?
Right. Great question. And so my true scholarly start was as a sentencing scholar. And that's what I would focus on, thinking about sentencing reform, changes to sentencing that needed to happen to make it fairer and to actually have sentencing line up with goals of punishment. And along the way, I've just realized that when I look at sentencing disparities, I've really realized that the criminal justice system is a culture maker, right? That it is telling a story to the greater public about who is a criminal and who needs to be punished and in what ways they need to be punished. And so when you think about it that way, I think that making changes in the criminal justice system and all the broad criminal justice system, so I'm talking police all the way through to the way we punish people, is also a way of changing culture and a way of acknowledging that racism is baked into our institutions and that we have to take real steps to change that approach. I think it's worth mentioning that today is Juneteenth, right? So we're commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. And when we reflect upon what that really means for us today, or when I reflect upon it, it's supposed to be a celebration of freedom, right? But I'm, of course, very cognizant of how far we actually have to go to realize the freedom that my ancestors were so joyously looking forward to. And when they heard that proclamation finally on Juneteenth. And so when we think about it that way, how far we have to go, it really paints the picture of this systemic and institutional racism. And what I mean by that is from that very moment of freedom, at every single turn, systems in America have been put in place to stifle that freedom. And so if we go through just the history of the US, we have slavery, there's Jim Crow, lynchings, right? And here's where we can have the police enter. Policing entered as a way to control Black bodies post-slavery. And so we have these institutions that really were developed to stifle freedom. And we've never really fully engaged with that history. And I think this is a moment where people are starting to do that and saying, okay, if this is really the root let's take a step back and think about different ways that we can actually achieve safety and stability, and all the things that we think we need through policing. But it has to start by recognizing the roots of the institution. And it's honestly true of all of our institutions. We could be talking about healthcare or banking or housing or education and having the same conversation.
And your work has that systemic focus. You, in a number of different places, propose some solutions to some of the systemic problems. You alluded to, I think, no, you straight up mentioned it earlier. Your work begins, or your scholarly career begins with federal sentencing. And federal sentencing and policing are not two things that, you know, I think a lot of people, myself included, we often see much of a connection. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about a suggestion in one of your articles about how judges and prosecutors can come to see the racial disparities in sentencing as having sort of this systemic effect in perpetuating racial disparity and the view of the Black body as criminal. Can you help us untangle that point just a little bit?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and again, I'll give you a little bit of background. You know, working in the federal sentencing area and really sentencing in general, you go to all of these conferences and you hear about sentencing disparities, racial sentencing disparities. And I mean, over and over again, you hear this story. And it's true, right? So Black people bear the brunt of harsh, lengthy sentences, sentencing laws and practices. You know, studies show that Black people are sentenced more harshly for the same crimes committed as whites and other groups. And, you know, I'm happy to give numbers if anybody wants any. But the idea is that the story that we've been telling for the last few years that's really gained ground is this idea of implicit bias, that the reason why we have sentencing disparities is because of implicit bias. People, because of just what society bombards us with, we all have sort of this ingrained bias against Black individuals, and we tend to view them negatively, even if we don't mean to, right? It's just in our minds. And so for those of you who haven't taken an implicit bias test, you can Google it now and take one, and you'll get those kinds of results. And so the thought is, well, implicit bias is what causes people, prosecutors to charge Black defendants more significantly. It's what causes juries to find them guilty more often. It's what causes judges to impose harsher penalties. They don't really mean to, it's just what's happening, right? And so in thinking about that, I wanted to challenge that a bit. Sure, implicit bias is there. Studies are bearing that out. But rather than saying that sentencing disparities are causing bias, I instead wanted to look at the ways that sentencing disparities are, instead of looking at the ways that bias is causing sentencing disparities, I wanted to look at the ways that sentencing disparities are actually feeding into bias. And so the longer that we continue to have systems that punish Black people more harshly than others, the more we're perpetuating a story that Black people are criminals, right? And so this is a story that your everyday person gets, that, when they see law enforcement presence in Black areas, that's what they see on the news, that's what they hear about. When they hear about the disproportionate numbers of Black people who are incarcerated, they're not filtering that in a way that gives a full context. And instead, that information just feeds into further bias of Black criminality. And polls are bearing this out. So there are polls that show that white people, first of all, I guess I should say that all people overestimate the incidence of Black people being involved in criminal activity. So when they do polls, people always overestimate it. For white people, it's even greater. But also polls year after year show that more white people, so a majority of white people, don't believe that the criminal justice system is unfair to Blacks. Now that's changing slightly, and I think this moment will change it even more, right? But if we're dealing with a majority of Americans who don't feel as though the criminal justice system treats Black people unfairly, and then what they see are disparities they see that, these disparities in sentencing. So they see Black individuals sentenced more harshly, then they think, oh, these stories about Black criminality are true. So what's the effect of that? What's the dangerous, I call it the dangerous perpetuation of racial bias? It then means when you're in spaces as a white person with Black people who enter the space, the suspicion of criminality is at the forefront. And that's why we get all of these living while Black in America scenarios of Black people doing everyday things, right, that any American should be free to do. And yet the police are called And the thought is because you've lost that presumption of innocence, not just from police officers, but from everyday individuals, because we have perpetuated this story of Black criminality, and our justice system carries it on by continuing to punish people unfairly and in disparate ways. And so to me, that is the connection.
And that kind of takes us to a question that one of our viewers has. I think there you're kind of getting at the culture maker idea again. That
Correct.
So we have these systems, federal sentencing being one, that create a culture of Black criminality, or I should say, perception of Black criminality.
Exactly.
And I think that right now we're seeing a lot of pushback on the police as a culture maker in the way that you're talking about, that over-policing in Black and brown neighborhoods and the manner in which the over-policing occurs too is just sort of reinforcing the idea that, well, they're there for a reason. Mm-hmm. And so we have a question from a UDM law student, and she says, Professor Exum, please speak to what defunding the police would look like. There's a lot of conversation about this, and she'd like to hear your opinion on how you think we can do this. And I'd add, how long, when can we do this?
Okay, great question, and shout out to UDM. Thanks to the UDM students for being out there listening. I appreciate you guys. Okay, so this term defunding the police has obviously gotten a lot of traction now, and for some it's a scary, radical term. For others, of course, they're embracing it. The whole idea when you're thinking about defunding the police is really about shifting resources. Now, there are some people who are true police abolitionists who say that we don't need police at all, but there really is a spectrum of folks who acknowledge that the resources that currently are being put into policing, so if you just look at budgets, right, the amount of budgets of states, of municipalities, federal government that goes toward policing and crime and punishment is basically overblown. And that if we actually moved money to systems and to support systems that actually do more of what we want and what we've put on police, then that actually serves us all. So think about it this way. If you just think to yourself, what do I think police are there for? Right? Why do I want to have police at all? Especially, and this is especially helpful, I think, to someone who sort of is nervous about this idea of defunding, right? So you're thinking about, well, what happens if I am in danger and I need to call the police? What happens if there's a crime and things like that? And then think about the way police actually have been called to respond to things, right? What things have police been called to? So things like, a person who just fussed at me for walking my dog has called the police and they respond to that. Somebody sleeping in their car in a Wendy's parking lot, police are called and they respond to that. Someone with some sort of mental health issue who needs mental health services, police are called for that, right? And on and on and on. And so really defunding the police is a call for saying, let's reimagine the way that we can use different services to address these issues. And this does not all have to be police issues. They don't all have to be police issues. They don't all include violence or the threat of violence. They're not all about solving crimes. And so that's really what is at the heart of defunding the police. And so when could it start? It could start now, right? And we've already seen it in some places where there have been votes to change budgets, to reconceptualize what goes to police, how different departments will be used. So it can start right away. The question is just, what are the end goals? What are you trying to say at the end of the day police are useful for or not useful for, and then making your decisions from there. So I am in full support of any sort of measures that are about changing the current institutional structure that we have and the current dependence on policing that we have. Absolutely.
So, and some of your work here fits with that idea pretty nicely. That some of the institutions we have, we may not need or want, and we really may just be sort of perpetuating a culture that's just the complete opposite of what we think are the ideals that make up our system. But then other parts of our system, we may just want to make some changes to, or think about a little differently. And that might be where, the Eighth Amendment as a civil claim comes in. But another suggestion you have in the article that is, I think your most recent article, that's kind of helpful for me to think about this is you equate, or I think you compare sentencing disparity to gender pay gap. And you give a useful idea for how we might help policymakers, and I'm saying policymakers, I mean prosecutors and judges, because when it comes to sentencing, there's a policy component there. And how can we give prosecutors and judges the kind of tools that we give businesses to help them eradicate the pay gap? Can we do the same thing to help judges and prosecutors eradicate sentencing disparities? So it was a bit of a convoluted question, but can you help us that one?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, because in this moment, we're also thinking about next steps, right? Once people are saying, okay, we're recognizing, we're on board with the idea of institutional and systemic racism, what do we do about it, right? And so that's what I was thinking through in this last article that was equating, or that was recognizing that sentencing and criminal justice system is a culture maker and that we have to be active in changing that culture. And so that's my pushback against just talking about things in terms of implicit bias. Because the thought of implicit bias is, well, let's just do some implicit bias training. We'll all be aware that we have biases, but at the end of the day, we still have them, right? And so the thought is that a better way to approach things, sure, do your trainings, try to eradicate implicit bias if that's possible, but to take some actual concrete measures to head on, limit and eliminate eventually racial sentencing disparities. And so I try to think about other areas where we've done that. So if you think about gender pay equity issues, what do you do to deal with that? We see the actual, we see the disparities in pay between genders. We can blame it on a bunch of things. We could say it's implicit bias, we don't mean to do it, but we're doing it. None of that is really at the heart of it, of changing it. The heart of changing it is, okay, let's look at the numbers. Publish your numbers. How much do you pay men? How much do you pay women? It's out there, and now fix it, right? And so I think we need to take steps in the criminal justice system, when I'm specifically talking about sentencing, to do the same thing. Data needs to be out there. Judges, this is what's happening in your courtroom. This is what's happening in this district. This is what's happening in this circuit, right? And so we actually have numbers that are not just studies that other groups have done, but that the actual courts do themselves. Hear the numbers, look at what's happening, how people's sentences are different based on race, and that race is a prevailing factor here. And then we have to move to the next step, which is don't do that, right? And it might seem too simple, and people like to explain away, well, the reason is there were these different facts in the case, and this case was a little bit different. Well, we can actually put those into transparent documents as well, right? Were they really? It was the same offense. Why is there such a big difference? Okay, these are things we can't do anymore. And there are many ways, we can think about ways to implement this, but that's really the starting point. Put numbers out there and don't do it.
And I think that is an explicitly radical statement. I chuckle because telling a federal judge, don't do it. I mean, that just doesn't happen. And from your time as a clerk, Professor, it's just, there are very few people who come into a judge's chambers, especially when it comes to sentencing, and says, you shouldn't be doing this. So it makes complete sense to me, because your example with gender pay is I thought right on point with sentencing, because that's the counter argument to some of these reforms to sentencing is always, well, this is bespoke justice tailored to the individual, when the individual is right there in front of the lawmaker, the judge, and the prosecutor, and they know the facts, they know the circumstances of the offense and the offender. And at some point you just say, well, that same logic applies to gender pay gap. I mean, every professional is going to come in with different circumstances. So it struck me as a perfect way to crystallize that point.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time talking to judges. I did a project where I went around and interviewed federal judges around the country. Still working on that project, but I've done a lot of talking to judges, and so I completely understand that there's this view of individualized sentencing, and the judge sort of knows, and they have their gut feeling about what's appropriate and all that sort of thing. But to me, that's really, again, the beauty of this moment, this current moment, where we have folks stepping out in institutions or through institutions saying, We recognize systemic and institutional racism. We're committed to making changes. And so for institutions that are saying that, we have to hold the players accountable. So if you're going to say, you know what, in the justice system, yes, we also recognize that there's institutional and systemic racism, and we're going to do something about it. Well, then those are judges, those are prosecutors, need to do something about it. And so they really have to take that on themselves. So it doesn't have to be other people are saying, judge, don't sentence this way. But judges actually can come to the table and say, okay, we're going to be at the forefront of making these changes. We're going to look at ourselves. It doesn't have to be personal, but it's understanding that institutionally these disparities exist and we have to do something about it.
So staying on the judges point, we have another question from out there. This one comes via email, and it's related to death penalty and racial disparity. Mm-hmm. So the question here, we recently saw the North Carolina Supreme Court issue a landmark ruling that grants more than 130 death row inmates the opportunity to have their sentences reduced if they can prove systemic racism affected their sentencing. With the extreme racial disparity in the death penalty and the federal government restarting executions, is there something similar we can push for in our own states or nationally?
This is a great question, and it actually gives me a chance to back up to something that I wanted to recognize earlier, which is that when I talk about death penalty on the streets and I use the Eighth Amendment as a possible vehicle for making some changes to policing and how we deal with police violence, I do that recognizing full well that the death penalty jurisprudence isn't perfect either, right? It's based on an ideal of the Eighth Amendment where the Supreme Court talks about human dignity and protecting lives. But the way it actually plays out is one that is extremely fraught with racial disparities and is very problematic in that way. And so this again is going to the baked in racism, right? And so for those of you who don't have the background on the death penalty, definitely there are huge racial disparities in the death penalty. And specifically, your highest chance as a defendant convicted of a capital crime of receiving the death penalty is if you are a Black person, a Black defendant who has killed a white person. And it's really the race of the victim that drives these death penalty cases and whether or not a jury will ultimately decide to impose death. And I can give a lot of more reasons about that if folks have questions about it, but what it boils down to is there are racialized outcomes. So a Black defendant who has killed someone white is more likely to be sentenced to death than any other combination of defendant and victim that we can put together. Now, recognizing this, several groups in states, also at the federal level, have tried over time to pass some form of a racial justice act. And so that's what this question is about. They do have a racial justice act in North Carolina, which is specifically about the death penalty and saying that if you can use evidence to show, or if you have evidence to show that your death penalty sentence was actually influenced by race, then bring that to us and the court will look at it. And this is a complete reaction to Supreme Court jurisprudence on the death penalty, which has essentially closed the door to arguments of racial bias in the death penalty. And so legislation is being used to do that. So absolutely, it's a model that if it gains enough political traction can be used in other states. And again, it's a change that just needs support. It's not something that the models are there. And so these are things that could be implemented immediately.
So staying on the criminal justice system and some changes we can implement immediately, we have two questions here, and one question, one comment, but they relate. Question is, what about rethinking what is criminalized and how that impacts Black and Brown communities? Added on to that, there's a comment that's just too much power is still left in the hands of prosecutors. I agree. But maybe a way to frame that there is, what do we do to limit prosecutorial discretion in line with what we have that's criminalized?
Yeah, great questions. And this is what I was starting with by saying that when we talk about things in terms of systemic and institutional racism, we have to admit that it is throughout all of our American institutions. And so criminal justice is no different, meaning that every phase of the criminal justice system has aspects of systemic racism at its roots. And what we choose to criminalize is no different. And so if you're thinking about all of the ways that we can really be intentionally anti-racist, we have to think about policing. We have to think about what we criminalize. We have to think about the power to charge. We have to think about how plea bargaining is actually carried out. We have to think about pre-trial detention. We have to think, I mean, there's, on and on, right? And so I don't want to suggest that there's one fix. We have several pieces that we have to really actively and intentionally work on. And it'll take a lot of work and it'll take a lot of time. But when we're specifically thinking about some of these sort of kind of front end, I guess measures, and thinking about how the criminal justice system actually enters into the picture. So what is actually criminalized, or how a person enters into the criminal justice system. That's certainly a place where it's legislative, right? And so our legislators are the ones who write the criminal laws, sometimes through the work or collaboration with the Sentencing Commission, that's thinking about the punishment that will attach to those crimes. But absolutely, we need to be thinking about whether behaviors that are criminalized should actually be criminalized. And if they are sanctioned, what are appropriate punishments, if any? And so, so there's lots of pieces to this. I'll give another example. I know I'm giving long answers, but there's a lot to say.
No, please.
Which is about, let's just take marijuana, for instance, right? And so we've seen a move across the country to decriminalize marijuana possession and use. And marijuana arrests, marijuana charges, marijuana convictions, and sentencing have been just those sorts of tools that have been used to really just put the hammer down on Black and brown communities. And then to say, oh, you know what? We're going to decriminalize those things and allow for a legal market. Just shows you how much these things that we criminalize are not really based on the need for safety and security, but instead just a way of controlling people, specifically minorities, and specifically those who are less socially and economically privileged than others. And so when we look at our criminal laws that way, we could start to take away a lot of things from the criminal code and saying, you know what, this doesn't need to be criminalized at all.
I work as a appellate public defender here, and I'm always worried about decriminalizing drugs because it ends up giving police discretion. Well, excuse me, decriminalizing at the state level while the federal level remains.
Yeah.
And yeah. I feel like this systemic injustice and racism that we see is compounded when police have discretion. And I think this kind of dovetails with the point you're making about, well, if they were, if now they can stop who they want to stop, and it's not necessarily illegal, who's still going to be arrested for these offenses, or who is going to have their car searched? Fine, it may be legal to possess it, but you're not supposed to be driving with it. And are we just going to see these disparities kind of shift, even if we decriminalize? So is there somebody kind of looking at the arrests and any data on how police interact with individuals when they have legal marijuana?
So a few answers there. So in the same way that I was suggesting that in sentencing, we put it all out there on the table, right? These are the disparities. This is what's happening in this court. Look at it, change it, right? We can do the same thing when it comes to policing, when it comes to arrests, especially if we're making it very narrow. So what about drug arrests for marijuana, right? Here's what's happening. Let's look at the racial disparities. Let's stop that, right? And there are groups that are working in that way. So when I was in Toledo, for a moment, I was working with a group that, they were really doing all the work. I just was sticking my head in here and there, who had gotten a MacArthur grant to really cut back on the arrest disparities, racial arrest and incarceration disparities in Toledo. And they were doing it really by looking at numbers and saying, let's look at how many times police officers are stopping and arresting people for various things, right? Let's put that out on the table, and let's talk about how that's not really productive. You don't need to be arresting for X, Y, and Z. You don't need to be stopping people for this or for that. And really just having that different conversation with police officers about expectations. and what they're supposed to be doing. But that goes down to a culture change, that goes down to changing the institution, right? So this all brings us back to the beginning, which is we can't continue with business as usual because these changes that we want to see don't happen in our current institutions and our current approaches to how policing is done, how charges are brought, how sentencing plays out. It just doesn't happen. We have to start from what our actual goals are, what we want to achieve. And if one of our goals is to reduce this racialized disparate treatment, we actually have to take paths to do that. We can't, it's not just going to happen on its own.
And
right?
it seems, I mean, is it fair to say that the path that you travel down quite a bit in your work is we need data. We need good data to really understand what's happening, because we've got the legal fiction of the presumption of innocence. We know that doesn't help much. And we have these deeply rooted biases and injustice in the system and the racism in the system. If the biases don't help us figure out where crime is really happening, then we need to have somebody collecting information. Right? Would you be in favor of sort of a federal clearinghouse that handles all arrest information, handles bond determinations, essentially somebody who's just monitoring every component of the system anytime the system has a discretionary decision built in, arrest, charge, bond, etc.?
Well, so I'm definitely in favor of collecting data, collecting and using data, absolutely. I do think that we have to be careful in the way that it's used, and what part of my hesitation comes from what's happening in sentencing now with evidence-based sentencing. This thought that, oh, if we just get more scientific about things, then we can come to better outcomes. And while I think that that's partially true, so collect data so that you know what's going on, I don't want us to be in a situation where we use data to just sort of perpetuate and validate racism. And so we see that, the danger of that in evidence-based sentencing, where the move has been, okay, if we collect data on risk assessment for risk assessment tools, who's at a higher risk of reoffending, and we're going to punish in line with what those risk assessment tools say. What ends up happening is, well, who's at a larger risk for reoffending? Okay, people with lesser education, less family support, who haven't been employed in 6 months. And that's all perpetuating the racism that we have throughout our society. It's basically saying, if Black individuals, racial minorities are suffering from our other societal ills more, that also enters into our risk assessment tool. They're at a higher risk of reoffending. And so that's my, I guess, my hesitation to the use of data. But absolutely, I believe that we should be collecting data on how arrests are made, what are the decision points, the outcomes as far as race go. That should be collected. And if it's at the federal level to centralize, that's fine with me. I think the same thing about police killings, right? Having a database for actually collecting information on police use of force. To me, it's about using the data, having the data so that we can have honest conversations about what's happening, and we don't really have a debate on whether or not this racism is there. Right, it's absolutely there. I did also want to add to the last question about marijuana. One other point that I meant to make is that I was at a conference where there were a group of marijuana regulators. So in places where marijuana use is now is legal or it's been decriminalized, it's now, of course, subject to regulation. And one thing that some of the regulators, who, by the way, were a group of Black women, I didn't know that there were such a powerful group of Black women who were in this regulatory space in all these places. And so that was really amazing to see. But they were saying that, at least one specific regulator was saying that she was seeing an increased call in for arrests for marijuana possession on the Black market, as they were calling it, by folks who had marijuana businesses, legal marijuana businesses now. So just the notion of saying we're gonna legalize things, if you don't also deal with these systemic issues, you just use a legal market to continue to suppress Black and brown communities. And that's even what's happening in marijuana. So I just think that any sorts of reforms that we make really need to be more than reforms, and they need to look to, are we actually dismantling the racism that exists instead of just covering it up with another system?
So two more questions here, and they both dovetail nicely with dismantling.
Mhm.
And one is police unions.
Yeah.
What role do they play in maintaining the current culture, and how have they been an obstruction to dismantling that current culture?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, probably, police unions are probably one of the bigger challenges when it comes to reforming current police institutions, right? And so this is actually, and the reason is because, unions are meant to protect employees. They're meant to protect employee interests. That's what they're there for. That's the benefit of them. And so I'm in support in this general sense of people organizing into unions and having that protection so that they have power in an employee setting. The difficulty is when it comes to police unions is that they can also stand in the way if you have individual police officers who are bad actors, right? Their interest in being protected is unions can be used, let's put it that way, unions can be used to protect the interest of the bad actor as well. And so unions may be resistant to any sort of change or reform if it alters something in that police employment space. If it changes the way they have to do their reporting, the way that they have to engage with one another, things that change the conditions of employment, the union will be there and will be a force to be dealt with. This actually is one of the reasons in support of this bigger notion of defunding the police. However, wherever you are on the spectrum of defunding, is a thought of moving money as a way of changing policing without having to necessarily run afoul of police unions. Meaning that if you just change how the resource structure is, that's something that's outside of the scope of many unions, and so it's a good tactic to employ. But really, when it comes to unions, this is where we go back to people on the inside of institutions actually acknowledging their own hand in institutional racism. And so some of this has to be on police leaders, the police unions, that they have to be willing to make changes as well. We can't do that for them, right? We can change around them. We can move funding. We can disband police departments. We've seen that in some places, but we can't actually cause unions to change or cause police officers to change their institution if they're resistant to it, right? We can change around them, but we can't change them. Hope that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Especially with respect to collective bargaining agreements, which seems to be the way that most police departments obtain some of their most significant protections that you were just talking about. I'm wondering, do you think though there's sort of some hope in the democratic process if more city council members are forced to be made aware of these of the inequities in these contracts by their constituents? Can change kind of happen despite the union holding the line?
Yeah, and to be fair, I think that there are folks inside, behind that blue wall of silence, the way they put it, who want change also, right? And so there are conversations that are happening in that space. But yeah, any sort of pressure from the outside, city councils, from constituents having their voices heard, saying what sort of changes they want to have made. And we're already starting to see some of that in some places. And so, yes, the democratic process certainly can be used to make changes. The budgetary process can be used to make changes. And also the union itself can be an agent of change if it so desires. And I think that in some spaces there is that will, other places are just a bit harder.
Staying on the agent of change idea, another question from UDM students. How can law students be agents of change, especially in reforming the criminal justice system? And speaking for my peers, she says, when I say we feel like we have little power as students, but we want to make a difference in our communities, we mean towards causes that are meaningful to us.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'd say to law students is to remember that as a law student, and then eventually as a lawyer, you're in a really privileged space, right? In this time of talking about systemic and institutional racism, we throw around the term white privilege quite often to remind white people that they've privileged from institutional racism, and calling on white people then to be those agents of change, right? To recognize their privilege and to use it to dismantle racism. When it comes to law students, you also have a privilege, right? Regardless of your race, you have this educational privilege. You've been you're in this place where you have knowledge that many other people don't have, or you'll have tools that other people won't have. And so my encouragement to you all is to recognize that and to use your knowledge and your privilege to amplify the causes of others. So what can you do as law students? You can connect yourself with community groups, whether it's through your university or in your cities, where they're doing a lot of this on the ground work, and you can offer your services, right? You can, and even though you're not licensed yet, so be careful about this, but you're not offering legal services in the sense of giving representation, but what you're doing is you're sharing knowledge, right? You're setting up, you're using your privileged space as a law student to set up spaces for people to gain knowledge, right? Setting up programming at your law schools that invite in the community around the issues that they need to be educated on and they need to work on. You are donating your hours through clinical work, right, to these sorts of causes. You're raising your voice in your law school about what you want your law school to pay attention to in the community. And so there's so many ways, but I just think if you think of it from a lens of privilege, of your own privilege, and how can you use that to help other people who aren't in that space, then you're on the right track. But there are just hundreds of different avenues to take to be helpful to others.
So we have time for one more question. And we have a good one. It's a four-parter, and
Okay.
it's very specific, although it would shift us back a little bit to our discussion about reforming police culture and the interplay between the union and reform movements.
Okay.
So with that setup, the question is, what data exists regarding excessive force related to, 1, a unionized police force, 2, police commission control, 3, outside investigation requirements, and 4, mayoral direct control. So let's start with, we'll take them one by one. What do we have on excessive force in unionized police forces?
You know what? I can take them all together, because the answer is
great.
we don't have a lot of centralized data on any of that. That's breaking down. Is it by union? What about police forces that are unionized, those that are not, those, and breaking it down that way. And that's part of the issue. So there are smaller groups that have collected this information just in their area, right? It is not something where we have actual police departments collecting information that's disseminated publicly, right? And so that is an important place to start. And when I say start, I really think that, we need to be doing a lot of things all at the same time, but that's an important piece of it, which is that we actually collect information that's useful. And so we don't have anything that really, some departments release their use of force statistics, and some groups have collected use of force statistics, but they're not broken down in the ways that the question asks, and they're done on a small scale. We don't have this for the entire nation.
Well, the optimist in me hoped there was a lot to talk about there, because there was a lot of data kept. And so as a result, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm going to say that's really the unfortunate piece, right? I mean, there's so much that's unfortunate, but it's another bit of it, which is that, and it goes back to police unions and protection of police officers, even if they're the bad actors, which is that it's hard to get information that paints the entire picture. And so it's easier then, and this is what we see playing out on the news time and time again, it's easier than to scrutinize that one case, right? So think about George Floyd and his death, his murder. It sparked so much outrage because we had a tape, right? We had this video, we see the officer on his neck, and we watch the life leave his body, right? And so people had this visceral reaction to it. And so we have this little piece. But using kneeling on individuals during an arrest, chokeholds, these are practices that have been going on forever and ever. And we don't have data to show how many times are these tactics used, when do they result in death, what was the underlying reason for approaching this individual, what was the determination about whether this was justified. All the things that people really want to know, we don't have that information, because the thought was, well, just focus on this one case and let's go back to, why was George Floyd there in the first place? What did he do with that police officer before the tape started? All these things that really are not the point at all, which is, let's back up and take a big view at this entire institution and the way that we are actually treating individuals, and the way that we are showing through our through use of force that we're allowing for this type of punishment outside of the judicial process.
So you've mentioned there, I think a nice way to end our conversation potentially. I'm curious because we've seen now just so many terrifying moments caught on video, and I have to tell you, I just didn't think George Floyd's murder was going to change much, because I thought what happened to Tamir Rice and Freddie Gray and Eric Kern and Philando Castile, I thought it's not going to do anything, but it really seems to have galvanized a movement. I'm also wondering, has any police force gotten this right? I mean, there have been consent decrees. There have been some internal changes in places. Is there a police force out there that is a model?
I mean, people have thrown out like the Camden, New Jersey Police Department, because that was an instance where there's been this momentum for defunding. Basically, what they did was disband the police department and sort of rebuild it, and under a community policing model. And so that's been used as a potential model for sort of changing police culture and changing police approach. For some people, let's put it this way, it is a change. And so there are significant things in the Camden Police Department that are, just being done in a much better, fair way than many other police departments. But there are also criticisms, because at the end of the day, there are still some of the kind of tried and true police institutionalized aspects that are there. And what I mean is talking about when police are called out, right? What do we use police for? Some of those things are still there, but that is, that's one model that folks can look at and use and think about things that work and things that don't work. That's the one that jumps to mind. Policing is so localized that there are just places where communities are different enough that policing feels different. And so it's hard to compare sometimes the smaller communities to bigger cities. And so, so that piece of it is difficult. So I can't say, look at this department or that, but Camden is one. And certainly I had the same thought that with George Floyd's death, maybe with his murder, this might be business as usual. We've seen this before. And I just, to leave it on a happy note or a hopeful note, I'm heartened by the momentum, the energy around this, the change in the discourse, by not talking just about bad police officers versus good police officers, but talking about institutions as a whole. And also having people say Black Lives Matter across, so many different platforms. This is bigger than we've seen before, and I'm hopeful that we can move forward with it.
Well, that's the time we have today, Professor Exum. Thank you for everything you've shared with us. Thank you for the work you've done on this. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. But
thank you.
Beyond the weekend, I hope we have many more conversations like this. I also hope ACS chapters at the student level and the lawyer chapter level continue to have programming on this topic, and that we take this conversation to a place where we can make systemic change in our communities. So with that, I will send along, there's been a couple requests, I will send along your work to the ACS National team, and I'm hopeful that we can get it sent out to our viewers. This has been wonderful, and thank you all for your questions.
Thank you all. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. Bye now.